Okay, it's 10 o'clock, so we're going to get started. We've got lots of great content to cover, so people will keep joining as we go. But welcome everyone to the California Policy Forum's webinar on 2024 ballot measures. We're really excited to talk to you about this hefty slate of ballot measures this year. So before we start, we're just going to get going with a little bit of housekeeping so that everybody's questions can be answered up front. You can go to the next slide. So the agenda for today, we're going to be talking to Chris from Snodgrass and Michelli. Apologies if I'm Michaels and it's spelled the same way, so I'll say Michelli.
McKaylee.
Perfect, Michelli. So he's a capital insider. He's going to talk to us about this year's kind of deal making and what happened behind the scenes for ballot measures. Then we're going to have some of our Philanthropy California and California Policy Forum staff go through the ballot measures and do a quick overview of some groupings of the measures from this year. And then we're going to talk about the advocacy lens, what nonprofits and philanthropy can do to engage in ballot measure education and advocacy during an election season. So just to answer everyone's housekeeping questions, this webinar is being recorded. Recordings and resources will be emailed to registrants in a few days. Please use the chat box to talk amongst yourselves. You can message an individual or you can message everybody by selecting that blue drop-down box at the bottom. You can use that to place comments as speakers talk. Please use the Q&A box to send questions to our speakers. You can upvote a question if you also have the same one, and that'll really tell us that it's a popular one. We'll make sure those questions get passed along to our speakers. If you want closed captioning, there's a button at the bottom that allows you to do that. And if you're having any technical difficulties or have any questions, please message our event tech using that chat function. So with that, I would love to get us started. We're really thrilled to be joined by Chris, who's an attorney and lobbyist and author and professor, a man who wears many hats. He's the founding partner of the governmental relations and advocacy firm of Snodgrass and Michelli. And he's going to walk us through some of what happened behind the scenes for the ballot measures this year. Chris, I'll pass it to you.
Great, Emily. You can hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Emily? Okay, great. Thank you. Okay. Well, thank you so much, everybody. As Emily mentioned, my name's Chris Michelli. I'm primarily a lobbyist in Sacramento, but do wear some of those hats that Emily was kind enough to mention. What I was going to do is set the stage for all of you before the remaining panelists talk specifics about the November 5th general election ballot and what it looks like beyond, obviously, the excitement from the top of the ticket down. But on Tuesday, November 5th, we, of course, will be holding our general election in California as well as across the nation. Now, as we led into early June, just last month, there were up to 14 measures that could have been voted on by the statewide electorate on November the 5th. However, over the course of several weeks in June, one measure was removed from the ballot. Several were removed by initiative proponents, and a few were removed by the California legislature, and actually a few were also added by the legislature. So what we're going to see is 10 measures that will be voted on by California voters on November the 5th. The evening of July 3rd, the Secretary of State assigned the numbers, and I'll mention that as we get closer. What's interesting about this ballot in particular was a number of the measures had actually qualified back in 2022, but not in sufficient time for the November 2022 general election ballot. You may be aware that about a dozen years ago, the California legislature and the governor at the time signed a measure. That was Governor Jerry Brown at the time, signed a measure that requires all the measures by initiative, i.e. by the people, by signature gathering, appear only on the November ballot. Prior to that time, voter initiatives could be placed on both the primary ballot, which of course is normally in June, except every 4 years, where we move it up to March. So this year, of course, in a presidential year, it got moved up to March the 5th. And then the legislature, the measures that the legislature places on the ballot can appear at either the primary or the general election ballot based upon their timing. And in fact, there were 3 measures that were going to be placed on the March 5th ballot. Governor Newsom wanted Prop 1, not only that designation by 1 for the mental health funding measure, but he also requested and the legislature agreed to push the other 3 measures over to the November 5th ballot. The other interesting aspect is the 2014 legislation that was authored by then Senate President Pro Tem Darrell Steinberg, who currently is our mayor here in Sacramento. And that measure, for the first time, allowed both initiatives as well as referenda, the ability to overturn a statute by the people, as well as initiative, placing a measure, either a statutory initiative or a constitutional amendment initiative on the ballot, to be withdrawn by the proponents up until the deadline that the Secretary of State qualifies those measures for the ballot. In other words, when the requisite number of signatures are gathered and the signature verification process is completed by the county, the 58 county registrars, then a measure is quote unquote eligible for the ballot. It is not until the 131st day by statute, by our California Elections Code, that the Secretary of State says that the measure is actually then qualified for the ballot. So one is eligible, the other is the qualified. And once it's qualified, then there's no pulling it back, if you will. So Senator Steinberg's bill in 2014 allows a proponent, the listed proponent for an initiative or a referendum, to withdraw that eligible measure. Now, we had only seen this occur twice before, and they were single proposals, initiatives that had that were eligible for the ballot. The one that people most recall is the privacy initiative. Anyways, this year it came into much greater play. So I'm going to give you sort of a run through of what transpired. Back in 2022, the legislature had adopted 2 proposed constitutional amendments. And interestingly, both of them were to remove provisions from the California Constitution. One was SCA 2 by Senator Ben Allen concerning public housing projects. And then the second one was ACA 5 by Assemblyman Evan Lowe to strike the language related to a marriage is between only a man and a woman, which the federal courts a number of years ago struck down as unconstitutional. However, the language remains in our Constitution. Well, here's the first interesting thing. The legislature, pursuant to Article 18 of the state constitution, allows them to place a measure on the ballot. Article 2 is on voting and direct democracy, and that's where the people have the power of initiative, referendum, and recall. Well, the legislature can place a measure on the ballot by a 2/3 vote. The governor plays no role. The governor signs bills. The governor does not sign proposed constitutional amendments. They have to pass by a 2/3 vote. The legislature also has the power, similar to that 2014 Steinberg statute I mentioned, to withdraw a measure from the ballot. We haven't seen that in quite some time. But basically, in the months of May and June, the legislature adopted Senate Senate Concurrent Resolution SCR 157 by Senator Allen. And when they adopted it, they withdrew that measure from the ballot. So even though SCA 2 to remove language related to public housing projects in the state constitution. He said, we'll leave that alone. They withdrew it from the ballot. ACA 5 remains on the ballot for November the 5th. And the legislature placed on the ballot ACA 1. This is by Assemblywoman Cecilia Aguilar Curry on local government financing, and basically allows, rather than a 2/3 voter approval, a 55%. We do this for educational bond measures. ACA 1, if approved, would allow a 55% vote of the local electorate for affordable housing and public infrastructure. Now, this one's kind of interesting too, because although ACA 1, Ms. Aguilar Curry has been pursuing this for years. She was finally able to get it through the legislature earlier this year, but based upon polling, figured out that affordable housing and public infrastructure polled the best. So she ran a second ACA 10, that made modifications to ACA 1. The other one is, you may recall last year, the California Business Roundtable and a number of other business groups had qualified a voter measure called the Taxpayer Protection Act, TPA. The idea from that measure was for basically all fees and taxes, including those passed by the legislature by a 2/3 vote pursuant to Prop 13, to go to the people for a vote. Also, fees and assessments by both local governments and the executive branch, agencies and departments, would have to do the same. And it was made retroactive to 2 years ago, basically to the beginning of 2022. The legislature and a number of interest groups were very unhappy with that measure, and they passed in the last month of the legislative session last year, 2023, ACA 13 by Assemblyman Chris Ward to increase voting thresholds. And basically that measure says any proposed constitutional amendment by initiative, so by the people, that imposes a higher vote threshold on whatever it is, doesn't matter whatever it is, that would then have to pass by the same threshold. So what does that mean? If the voters decided that they wanted to create a new voting threshold for something and made it, say, 70%, then their measure would have to first pass by 70% in order to go into effect. That is if the voters approve ACA 13. And the idea here is that this would be a go into effect on after the March primary, in time to basically affect the Taxpayer Protection Act on the November 5th ballot. Well, the governor asked, as I mentioned earlier, for all the ballot measures that were on March 5, except for the mental health one, to be deferred to November 5th. So they moved that to November 5th. Well, the legislature and governor and former senator John Burton sued. They brought what's called an original writ to the California Supreme Court, and they said, Supreme Court, we believe that the Taxpayer Protection Act, remember, this is already qualified for the ballot. They said, we believe that this is unconstitutional because it limits the ability of state and local governments to adequately raise revenues to fund government services. So it was brief. Now, historically, the California Supreme Court has generally said, no, we're not going to decide until after the voters speak. So most people, and by the way, the justices' questioning of the proponents and opponents gave every indication to most court observers that they were probably going to follow their usual suit and that they would defer until after the voters had decided. Why? Hey, if they vote it down, then there's no litigation and there's no constitutional issues that they have to deal with. If the voters do pass it, well, then they'll address it. However, to the surprise of almost everyone, the California Supreme Court unanimously decided that this proposed initiative, remember, it had gotten 1.4 million signatures from the voters to get on the ballot, and they said, nope, this amounts to a revision rather than an amendment. And basically, under Article 2, that's where we have direct democracy again. The voters can amend the Constitution, they cannot revise it. What's the distinction? That's a legal thing that we don't have to get into here, but suffice it to say, the court said unanimously 7-0. No, this is such a fundamental change to government, we're actually pulling it off the ballot. So as a result, the legislature turned around and as part of a bill that was enacted on June 27th, AB 440, they moved ACA 13 Ward, again, increasing the voting thresholds to the November 2026 ballot. Now, what else qualified and then was taken off? There was the millionaire tax for those making more than $5 million. The idea of this millionaire surcharge was to fund pandemic detection and prevention efforts by the state of California. And the legislature and the governor and the proponents of that measure negotiated some language in one of the legislature's budget trailer bills that was adopted by June 27th. And so because of that, the proponent withdrew that measure off the ballot. For about 2 months, the legislature and the governor had overseen some negotiations between the business community and organized labor groups and trial lawyers to deal with PAGA, the Private Attorneys General Act, which basically allows employees to sue employers for alleged labor code violations. This has been on the books for 20 years. The business community has always complained about it. They finally qualified a measure in late 2022, not enough time to make it to the 2022 ballot. And basically, they had hoped that they could negotiate a deal with labor and trial lawyers. And indeed, they were able to do so. So they enacted on a very expedited basically a bill by Senator Umberg, the Senate Judiciary Chair, and Assemblyman Caller, the Assembly Judiciary Chair, and the two of them got together, and these two measures went through the legislature in less than a week, and so the proponents withdrew that measure. One of the early measures that had qualified for the ballot was an effort to raise the minimum wage to $18, and that remained. Then there was the referendum. There was a lot of news about this in 2022 and then again last month. This was a bill by Senator Lena Gonzalez that basically prohibits new oil and gas wells near homes and schools and hospitals. And the independent oil producers were successful in filing a referendum and getting the requisite number of signatures. And that meant the bill has been on hold. So even though the legislature passed it, the governor signed it, once the referendum qualified, then it was placed on hold. Well, the proponents of the bill, the SIPA, California Independent Oil Producers or Petroleum Producers, something along those lines, they withdrew the measure of the ballot. They decided that they didn't want to spend the money, and it probably wasn't going to be successful. The next measure that was placed by initiative is the proposal by the head of the California AIDS Foundation. He's tried this twice before to expand local government authority to enact rent control on residential property. There was no effort to negotiate it off the ballot, and that remains. There was a lot. You had to have had your head buried in the sand, so to speak, if you weren't aware of the fact that earlier this year, the California District Attorneys Association, the retailers, and other law enforcement groups were successful in qualifying a measure for the ballot that would basically undo several of the things that were adopted by the voters a decade ago in Prop 47. So this measure would increase the number of felony charges again and increase sentences for both drug and fentanyl use as well and distribution, as well as retail theft crimes. There was a great effort by the legislature, in particular, and the governor to try and negotiate this measure off the ballot. They tried legislation, their own retail theft and fentanyl legislation, whether or not it was going to be dependent on passage of this measure or not. Then at the last minute, the governor and the legislature gutted and amended a bill to place a measure on the November 5th ballot as a competitor to this. And then within 24 hours after the bill came into print, the governor dropped the proposal and it fell by the wayside. That took up a lot of effort by the legislature and governor leading up to that June 27th deadline. Two other measures that remain on the ballot. One is to restrict healthcare providers that meet certain criteria, basically targeting this same group that put the residential rent control measure on the ballot, that they have to spend 98% of their revenue on healthcare. And then the efforts by the medical providers, especially the California Medical Association, CMA, to dedicate basically a revenue stream from the federal government that helps pay for Medi-Cal healthcare providers to make it permanent funding for those providers. The legislature and governor, like this year, continually try to divert some or all of that money to help backfill revenue shortfalls in the general fund. This group doesn't want it. The governor's opposed to this. He came out recently and said so. His former chief of staff was one of the campaign advisors of this measure, and he resigned from that position because the governor was opposed to this. So this one has created a lot of heartache for folks. Another interesting one that made it to the ballot was to have California be one of 24 states. We are now the 26th state to require a 1-semester personal finance course for high school graduation. The legislature tried to pull this one off. Ultimately, they were successful. Assemblyman Kevin McCarty ran through a bill on an urgency basis to enact this by statute, which was done, and so the proponent withdrew it from the ballot. The last one that was withdrawn from the ballot. So remember, all these ones where I say they were withdrawn, these they were all eligible for the ballot, except the legislature and the proponents, came to some sort of agreement to pull them back. The last one was to provide some additional healthcare funding for children's hospitals and children with certain medical conditions. They too negotiated language in a budget trailer bill, and as a result of that, the proponent withdrew the measure. Then at the last minute, the legislature placed 2 general obligation bonds, we call them GO bonds, on the November 5th ballot. One is for climate programs funding, $10 billion, and the other for education facilities. You may have heard that over the last 2 years, there's been up and down swings in these negotiations between legislators, the 2 houses, proponents, interest groups, the governor, and housing was the third one that they were considering. Basically, the housing proponents believed that they had gotten adequate funding resources in the state budget. So they dropped that one out. And so we're left with the 2 GO bonds. And then the legislature, after a few aborted efforts in prior years, got one more constitutional amendment, basically to change the language of our Constitution to prohibit slavery in any form. One of the targets of this is prison labor, who were paid roughly 74 cents an hour for any work that they do as a prisoner and are state prisoners. The last thing that I'll leave you with, so the legislature, up until the deadline, added 3 new measures to the ballot, that ACA and the 2 GO bonds. The last thing I'll note for all of you is that they also adopted that measure that moved ACA 13, the voter threshold, to the November 2026 ballot. What they also did is they designated numbers for the measures placed on the ballot by the legislature. So as a result, we have 10 measures total, down from 14. But remember, the proponents took 6 off, the court took 1 off, and then other measures were placed on the ballot. So Prop 2 is the education facilities GO bond. Prop 3 is the marriage equality measure. Prop 4 is the climate GO bond. Prop 5 is the local government financing vote threshold to 55%. Prop 6 is prohibiting slavery in any form. And then we jump to the higher numbers for the voter initiatives. Prop 32, minimum wage to $18. 33 is the rent control. 34 is the limitation on healthcare provider spending. 35 is the Medi-Cal funding, quality assurance fee. And then last is Prop 36, the criminal justice package. And so those are our 10 measures. So this year, we have seen just about everything. The legislature placing measures on, taking them off. Proponents of initiatives, putting them on, taking them off. And of course, we've only seen 2 times in the last 50 years the court, the Supreme Court of California, remove a measure from the statewide ballot before the voters even vote for it. So quite the lead up to the November 5th ballot. I know I went over my time, Emily, but gave everybody a full background. So
yeah, I appreciate that in-depth description of everything that's been happening. There's obviously been a lot of moving pieces. So what I'll ask you is, can you leave us with your kind of 1-minute thoughts of what this means for the future and what this means for our audience that includes nonprofits and philanthropy?
yeah, well, a couple of things. One is, I think for good or for bad, remember in 1911 when California voters adopted direct democracy initiative referendum recall, it was really as a check on the legislature and the governor. It was actually to go against the power of the railroads, particularly Union Pacific. Today, again, for good or for bad, it is definitely being used as a leverage tool to get some sort of favorable legislation through the legislative process that maybe couldn't go on its own. So what I see is a greater politicization of the initiative process. So I think we'll see a future with more of that, again, for good or for bad.
Well, thank you for that. Super informative. It's always helpful to have somebody who knows the ins and outs of what's been happening and that we may not be seeing. So thank you so much, Chris, for joining us.
Of course. Good. Thank you so much. Okay. Bye.
Yeah. So now we're going to move to our California Policy Forum staff to bring you through a ballot measure overview. Jeanette, Liana, and Carla, please take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Emily. So we really appreciate Chris kind of giving you the backstories on what went down in Sacramento this year and all the legal considerations. But Liana and I are going to give you more specifics about the 10 measures for this year. And I'll just introduce myself really quickly. I'm Jeanette, the new Public Policy Director for Cal Nonprofits. Liana, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Jeanette, and good morning, everyone. I'm Liana Molina. I'm also relatively new. I'm about 10 months in at Northern California Grantmakers. I'm the Director for Policy and Movement. Very pleased to be here.
All right. And so our intention with this section of the presentation is to give you a pretty quick rundown on the basics of this year's measures without getting too into the weeds, since we don't want to be here for hours. But we want you to walk away feeling like you have a pretty good grasp of what you're going to be voting on and why. And to help you make sense of these 10 ballot measures, we're going to present them in some groupings to help you frame how to think about these issues and give you the right context for each one. So we do encourage you to research major opponents and supporters for any measures you're curious to learn more about, just because in the interest of time, we can't get to all of that. So next slide. All right, and so the first grouping we're going to present to you are the big bonds, and that's Prop 2 and 4. So Chris, touched on this, but just to reiterate here, these were placed on the ballot by the legislature, which requires a 2/3 vote. So lawmakers are asking you here, you the voter, to let them do long-term borrowing to raise significant funding for 2 areas. One is Prop 2, and that's 10 billion for schools, and that funding is really oriented around modernization of school facilities, repairs, or new construction of schools. Of the 10 billion, 1.5 is for community colleges. I'll note that there is no allocation for the UCs. School districts are pretty eager for this to pass, obviously, because they want to be able to complete repairs and projects, and voters have not approved a school bond since 2016. So since then, all that funding has dried up. I'll note that there is a fund matching requirement, which means districts must raise a local bond to be matched by some of the state bond money. And then we've got Prop 4, which is another $10 billion, and it's a climate bond. It's the largest investment in conservation in the state's history if this passes. It's got really strong support from community-based organizations and environmental justice groups. And these resources are aimed at helping vulnerable communities adapt and build resilience around wildfires, flooding, and all of these increasing climate threats that we're facing. It's got a really detailed breakdown on how the allocations will be spent, around clean air, safe drinking water, extreme heat mitigation, parks. So take a close look at that and see how those investments will make an impact. And just as a reminder, bonds are not a tax increase. They're borrowing to raise large sums of money that get repaid in the annual state budget over time. But obviously, they are repaid with taxpayer revenue over time. And these two only need a simple majority to pass. And next slide.
All right, I think that's my section. So we've grouped these next set of propositions as Californians' opportunity to help correct past wrongs. And we did hear in the previous speaker's comments about the context of some of these. So I'm going to talk about Proposition 3 and Proposition 6, which were also placed on the ballot by the legislature and are constitutional amendments requiring 2/3 vote. So Prop 3 is ACA 5, and it would reaffirm the right of same-sex couples to marry and remove the outdated language from Proposition 8, which was passed by voters back in 2008, which characterizes marriage as between a man and a woman. So again, this measure would codify marriage as a fundamental right for all people in California, and it'll ensure legal protection even if there are administrative changes in the federal government after the November election. Recent polling indicates strong support for this measure. No major campaign for or against are anticipated, but certainly something to keep your eye on if you're interested in marriage equality, civil, and human rights protections. So moving on, California's constitution currently allows for forced labor as a form of punishment, which is considered one of the last remnants of slavery. Proposition 6, which is ACA 8, would limit forced labor in state prisons and prohibit slavery in any form. Lawmakers also added this on late. It would change the language in our Constitution, which currently reads about prohibiting slavery in all its forms, to specifically name a prohibition to slavery and indentured servitude in our state prisons. It's important to note that the California Black Legislative Caucus included this amendment in its overall reparations bill package. It's the result of many years of advocacy and organizing by justice reinvestment advocates and many who were supported by foundations who are also invested in criminal justice reforms. It's unlikely to garner much opposition. I'm going to kick it back to Jeanette.
All right, next slide. Yep. And Prop 36, which we're calling the measure without a ballot vote, which I'll touch on in a second, but this one expected to be pretty contentious. So as background, 10 years ago, voters approved Prop 47, which reduced crime measures like changing certain low-level crimes from potential felonies to misdemeanors. Now we've got Prop 36 here that comes in and repeals much of Prop 47. So that means it will increase penalties for theft and drug crimes and allows felonies for some of those associated crimes. This measure is being pushed by district attorneys and really big retailers like Walmart, Target, and Home Depot. The additional spicy context on this measure that Chris also touched on is that Governor Newsom wanted to counter this measure and override Prop 36 with his own measure that would have superseded its provisions if it had passed and he had got it on the ballot. But he had to scrap his efforts at the last minute because he just couldn't get the support needed in the final days of the legislative session. So we are just left with Prop 36 and expect a lot of ads around this one. And next slide.
All right, so Proposition 35 is also one we would deem fairly non-controversial. It is a healthcare access measure which would make permanent a tax on managed healthcare insurance plans, which is currently set to expire in 2026. This initiative is sponsored by California's healthcare industry to raise more money for Medi-Cal and to block lawmakers from using the cash to avoid cuts to other programs. The measure would hold Newsom accountable to a promise to permanently secure that tax money for healthcare for low-income patients. Prop 35 addresses the state's most urgent healthcare priorities by securing dedicated ongoing funding without raising taxes to protect and expand patient access to care at community health clinics, hospitals, emergency rooms, primary, family planning, mental health providers, OBGYNs, and specialty care providers like oncology and cardiology. It's supported by a broad bipartisan coalition. Our state has made great strides in expanding healthcare coverage for vulnerable populations over the last several years. Proposition 35 poses an invitation, especially for healthcare foundations, those invested in health access and equity, the social safety net, and state and local budget advocacy, to learn more and determine if and how your institution would like to engage.
All right, and on to Prop 5, the voter threshold measure. So that certainly doesn't sound like the sexiest of topics, but the measure could have a really big impact locally in your communities because it means that passing special taxes or local bond measures that fund affordable housing and public infrastructure get a little bit easier. So it lowers the approval needed from 2/3 to 55%. Anti-tax groups are opposed to this, but with a really busy ballot this year and other much more high-profile measures, this one might just fly under the radar. So next one.
All right, I think this is the final one. It is Proposition 32. It's already titled the California Living Wage Act. And we heard a little bit about this earlier. It was originally intended for the November 2022 ballot, but was delayed until 2024 due to that deadline error. So it would raise the state minimum wage to $18 an hour, which would be the nation's highest, by 2026 for all employers, though the phase-in timeframe would vary depending on the company size. Starting in 2027, annual increases would be adjusted according to the cost of living. This initiative seemed like a much bigger deal when it was first proposed back in 2021. But under existing law, the overall minimum wage has risen to $16 an hour, and lower paid workers in two huge industries are getting more. Fast food workers received a $20 an hour minimum on April 1st, and healthcare workers will eventually earn $25, though that start date has been pushed back to at least October 15th. Currently, there are no committees registered in opposition, though the California Business Roundtable and the Restaurant Association opposed the proposal back in 2022. So they may ramp up opposition as we near the election. Something to keep an eye on. Anti-poverty, worker justice, asset building funders, and others should keep an eye on this measure and learn more from your grantees on how to best support. Thank you. I think we're kicking it over to Carla now.
There's one more slide, actually.
Oh, one more slide. My
Yep.
apology.
All right, we've got one grouping left, and the man in the middle of that grouping is Michael Weinstein. So he's the CEO of the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, and over the years, he's used his organization's resources to wade into political campaigns, including sponsoring state and local ballot measures. Prop 33 is his latest effort, and he's attempted twice to expand rent control in the past and did not succeed. So Prop 33 is the third attempt. And then we've got Prop 34, which is sort of an unusual initiative in that it would stop Weinstein from using his organization's money to support political causes. It's essentially written in a way that it only targets the AIDS Healthcare Foundation so that he can't spend money in the future on these sort of measures. The supporters of Prop 34 are probably hoping that he's going to have to spend money trying to defeat Prop 34, and that means he'll have less money to spend trying to get Prop 33 passed. And then to circle back to Prop 33, that measure authorizes local government's ability to expand rent control to more properties, which means repealing Costa-Hawkins Act, and now single-family homes and new construction would no longer be exempt from rent control policies. This one definitely has some potentially complicated consequences, which are worth looking into when you evaluate it. Namely, there are many conservative and anti-development cities that see this measure as a way to stop any new housing, especially multifamily, because they could then create very strict rent control, laws that would make it impossible for any developer to have a financially feasible project. So its potential is indirectly freezing all growth in a city that wants it that way. This one could definitely get contentious as well, so take a close look at it. And now we'll turn it over to Carla.
Thank you so much, Jeanette and Liana. I know that we have shared and thrown a lot of information to you all as the audience. And we have a great last segment that our colleague Rhiannon is going to go over, which is going to talk about how both philanthropy and nonprofit can actually engage during election season, prepare for election season, and what are some of the actions that they can do. We understand that sometimes for both nonprofits and for philanthropy, it can feel a little bit iffy engaging in elections. Are we going against our 501c3 status? So Rhiannon is going to go ahead and talk a little bit about that. But before, we wanted to also share a little bit of just acknowledgement that we understand that ballot measures, but elections in general have an impact on the nonprofit and philanthropic sector. While it's hard to, at this stage, gauge exactly how much a ballot measure is going to impact the nonprofit and the work that they're doing with their communities or impact the communities that they serve, it's also, philanthropy also kind of struggles with that as well. How will the upcoming ballot measures that are passed impact how we fund communities and how we fund a lot of the organizations that are doing the good work that some of these ballot measures touch? And it's also challenging because, as you can see, although it's only 10 ballot measures, a lot of these are intersectional. We have one on climate, but the climate work impacts education, healthcare, food security, and our workforce. So we're not just talking about a climate measure. We're talking about how it's going to roll out and impact. And it's important for nonprofits as well as philanthropy to have, not just during election season, but in preparation, have conversations with both staff as well as with their funders around how are you preparing for the elections? Are you doing election scenario planning? And you can, for nonprofit, this type of scenario planning can include what is on the ballot. Will there be a big shift in like the political landscape? And if so, how is it impacting some of the communities that we work closely with? And more importantly, how can we actually continue to gain support for the work that we're doing and prepare for elections, not just monetary support, but also staffing support? And how can nonprofits support the staffs that they work with, right? Ensuring that their staff have the resources that they need, that staff has the time that they need, and also that the nonprofit has the time that they need in order to pivot whatever changes may come their way. And because of that, we highly encourage nonprofits to not just spend time learning about what's happening in the political coming up to the election season, but also talk to community partners. How are other community partners that you work with, that you partner with, how are they thinking and talking about the upcoming elections and what's on the ballot? And are they foreseeing any changes in how they'll do work or foresee any changes in how they may impact the communities that they serve? Talk to talk to the communities that you actually serve. What is top of mind for them? What are their challenges? What are they hearing from other folks that they engage with? And a lot of the times it's great to bring this information to funders, to the folks that the philanthropy partners that you have, and ask them as well. Are you doing election scenario planning? Do you foresee any shifts in how you're going to fund our organizations, how you're going to fund the communities? What's happening as we approach an election season is top of mind for you as a funder, and how are you preparing, and how can that help inform how we as nonprofits also prepare? So we encourage these type of conversations amongst both nonprofits as well as your philanthropic partners, because the more informed that we are about what our concerns are, what we're working on, what are some of the challenges that we foresee, but some of the challenges that we're already dealing with, can help us not just plan, but also become better partners to one another and truly continue to build this trusting relationship between both the nonprofit as well as philanthropy. So we encourage you to also have those type of conversations. We here at Southern California Grantmakers, Northern California Grantmakers, and Catalyst of San Diego and Imperial Counties, we work with the philanthropic sector. So we also are having these conversations with our members, and we are asking them these questions, and we're also happy to be a resource and connect with you all about what's top of mind for us as a nonprofit ourselves, but also what we're hearing from philanthropy to also help prepare for not just big elections like we have this year, but also the local and the state elections. Those are also incredibly important as well. And it's important for funders to also keep those in mind, not just the big ones that may shift the political landscape, but also the regional, local elections that have impact on the local nonprofits and communities that you currently serve. So with that, I'd love to hand it over to Rhiannon, who's going to talk a little bit about the advocacy lens. And this is really going to get more into what as nonprofits you can and cannot do in supporting a lot of the work that you do, as well as for funders. Where can funders also step in, and what role do funders play in elections, but also the opportunity to fund a lot of the work that you are already funding with just a little bit of an advocacy lens. So she's going to talk about how that is permissible and how you can go ahead and do that. So Rhiannon?
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Rhiannon McAfee, pronouns she, her, hers, and I am joining you today from the ancestral lands of the Kumeyaay people. And I'm the public policy consultant for Catalyst of San Diego and Imperial Counties. A caveat before we start, I am not a lawyer. I cannot give legal advice. If you ever have qualms or questions about a specific action that you would like to take, absolutely run it by a lawyer. But we are going to spend the next chunk of time talking about how you can engage in ballot measure education and advocacy. So very quickly, let's get the big issue out of the way first, which is, yes, nonprofits and public foundations can absolutely take positions on and advocate for or against ballot measures. It is not partisan electoral activity. It's not even nonpartisan electoral activity. I'm going to just take a quick moment to explain why with just a really basic definition of lobbying. We get to the next slide. One more. Ooh, click the button again and see if the rest of it shows up. There it is. Direct lobbying, very simple. It's communication with a legislator that expresses a view about specific legislation. Next slide. Other type of lobbying, indirect lobbying, also very simple. Communication with the public that expresses a view about specific legislation and includes a call to action. So why do we care about lobbying when it comes to ballot measures? Next slide. Because a ballot measure is not a person. It's a piece of specific legislation. And when it comes to legislation that goes to the voters become legislators. So thus, any attempts to influence voters on ballot measures is not electioneering, it's lobbying. If you can lobby, you can take a position on and advocate for or against ballot measures. One more time. If you can lobby, you can take a position on and advocate for or against a ballot measure, including, but not limited to, telling voters how to vote on them. Next slide. So that begs the question, can you lobby? Well, nonprofits and public foundations can absolutely lobby, either under the unsubstantial part test or by taking the 501H election. The insubstantial part test is the default. Tax authorities will say you could spend maybe 3 to 5% of your time and money lobbying under that test, but the IRS doesn't seem inclined to give any actual definition of what constitutes an insubstantial amount, which is why I always recommend to every nonprofit, make the 501H election because it's very simple to do and it gives you very clear definitions of exactly how much lobbying you can do, which you can see on the screen right now. So, next slide. Big takeaways before we get into the that you can do. If you take nothing away from this part of the presentation, take away these two things. If you are eligible to take the 501H election and you have not done it, you should do it now. Maybe not now, maybe after the webinar, but you should definitely do it ASAP. Number two, nonprofits can engage in ballot measure activity from a simple endorsement to actually writing, circulating, and campaigning for their own ballot measure. So Knowing what you can do begs the question, okay, but how? What exactly is the it that I can do? So we're going to spend the rest of our time on exactly what you can and can't do. If you are a private foundation, please don't change the channel. While you can't lobby, this information is also important for you to know because you can share it with your grantees if they don't know it. And we will be discussing things that you can do even if you can't lobby. For those who can lobby, we're going to start with an understanding that there comes a point in ballot measure advocacy when you will trigger reporting requirements. And unless you're going to go big, which you may want to do someday, you're probably not going to delve into that just yet. So let's take a quick look at those things. Next slide, please. And there we go. So don't spend more than $1,000 in independent expenditures for or against a ballot measure, because that makes you an independent expenditure committee. Don't take more than $2,000 a year in donations specifically to advocate for or against a ballot measure, makes you a recipient committee. Don't give more than $10,000 to a ballot measure campaign, that makes you a major donor committee. And also don't spend more than $50K in 1 year of donor funds on ballot measures, or more than $100K in 4 years. And very importantly, which I didn't put on this slide, which I should have because it's very important, don't coordinate with the ballot measure campaign. And you have to do it by yourself. If you are interested in coordinating with a campaign and going big or running major independent expenditures for a ballot measure campaign or running your own ballot measure, that's a whole other webinar. So we're going to focus our time here on what you can do that doesn't trigger disclosure or reporting. Next slide. First and foremost, get your endorsement on. You can endorse a ballot measure for or against. You can then announce that at one of your regular meetings and in member communications. Why is that a huge deal? Because you are a trusted messenger to your people. Whatever your org focuses on, there is a specific demographic out there that trusts you more than any other messenger. And tons of people make their decisions on ballot measures solely by endorsements. People look at that endorsement list on a ballot measure and think, are those my people? If the answer is yes, sometimes they don't necessarily do much more research. Or alternately, if they look at it and say, oh yeah, no, those are not my people, they're going to vote no on that measure without much more thought. Once you have publicly endorsed a campaign, just very little lift, costs very little, if any, money. What the ballot measure does with that information is kind of up to them, and you don't really have any control over it. If you're a big org, they may add a question to their next poll about how people feel about your organization and if your endorsement would make them more likely to vote yes on it. They may add it to their list of endorsements. They might slap your endorsement on one of their mailers and send it to people they think are your demographic. They may add a line to their phone bank script that you have endorsed their campaign. They might use it in a TV ad. You can contribute mightily to a campaign by barely doing anything. It's the number one easiest and kind of most important thing you can easily do. Now, my caveat to that is if you do endorse a campaign and they don't do any of those things, please don't be offended. They have a reason. Maybe it didn't poll well with the people they need to convince. Maybe they already have your demo locked in. And maybe it's just not something that they need. What else can you do with that basic endorsement without it counting towards that limit? You can send it to your members. Remembering that members has a very specific meaning to the legal entities that be, which means that they have the right to vote on changes to your bylaws, or they pay or have membership dues. However, you can also announce your endorsement in a regularly scheduled newsletter that goes out to people who have opted into your mailing list. Anything done for that would not be done for a regular newsletter does count as an independent expenditure. But these are simple and easy things that you can do. Now, what might effect that have? Well, besides letting your people know that you have endorsed that measure, it educates them, influences their vote. They may tell their friends about it. They may post it on social media. And if it's your mailing list and they are people who are inclined to donate to things or volunteer for things, your simple endorsement and letting them know that you have endorsed it may make them inclined to find that ballot measure campaign and donate to it or volunteer for that campaign. Next slide. Minimal staff time. your staff can use up to 10% of paid time in a month working on campaign activities within your org. And that is per employee, not per total employee time. So when your staffers are writing that article for your e-newsletter or you're having that endorsement meeting with your board, you got to make sure your staff is tracking that time somewhere to be able to show anyone who may ever question how much time you're spending that no one went over 10% of their paid time. Next slide. This is a really important one. Up to $999 in independent expenditures. The second you hit that $1,000, you have to register as an independent expenditure committee. May not seem like a lot of money, but it can go far because a lot of independent expenditures don't cost very much. What is an independent expenditure? It's anything that expressly advocates for the qualification, passage, or defeat of a clearly identified ballot measure and is not coordinated or done at the request of the ballot measure committee. Your best bet whenever you're doing independent expenditures is to not talk to or engage with the actual official ballot measure campaign in any way. So examples of easy independent expenditures that don't go over $1,000, sending out an email to your list announcing you've endorsed the measure and why. A specific email just about the ballot measure, and you can calculate what that's worth, right? You can calculate how much you spend on your email marketing company. Say they charge you $100 a month and your nonprofit sends 4 emails that month. One of them is a specific email about the measure. Sending that email technically costs you $25 plus the staff time to create the email, right? Say it took them an hour, they're paid $25 an hour. That independent expenditure was $50. Stick it on that spreadsheet where you're tracking your employees' time, right? What about putting an article about the endorsement on your website or in social media? Staff time to write and post it, overhead expenses of your website and internet fees, an op-ed from your CEO, or some clients with some client stories about how the measure would affect their lives. The cost of that, time spent on writing and placing it. Another big one for a campaign. That's a public quote from your CEO that is out in the public so the campaign can use it if they want. Hey, the CEO of X organization calls this measure the best thing to happen to puppies in years. They can use that information because it's public, right? And that's what's key to all of these actions is not coordinating with the ballot measure campaigns. Don't tell them what you're doing. Don't ask them to read your article before you send it. Don't ask anything from them. You can use anything from their public-facing materials, including their messaging, but not anything that they send you that is not widely and easily accessible to the public. That being said, always remember that when you're making a small independent expenditure, a lot of the effect of those actions lie in what the official campaign decides to do with it. But they shouldn't be telling you what they're doing. If they try to tell you what they're doing, that's when you stick your fingers in your ears and give them the no, I can't hear you, I don't want to hear it, right? And next slide. If you want to do something more than these types of small independent expenditures, you absolutely can. You can register as an independent expenditure committee and run phone banks or advertisements. It just triggers reporting and disclosure rules. You register as whatever kind of committee you're going to be and report everything you spend. More complicated, but a step you may want to take someday if there's a really, really important ballot measure, like many LGBT organizations did during the Prop 8, right? There may come a point where a ballot measure becomes so important to your org that you need to go all in. Until then, start small, right? So changing gears a little bit before I run completely out of time, because I know that there are some private foundations out there that are thinking, none of this is relevant to me because I can't lobby. Somewhat true. And there are foundations that can lobby who may not ever want to engage directly in ballot measures. But there are still ways to engage that are not even considered lobbying. Next slide. First off, you can do the same kinds of things that you do when you're engaging in issue advocacy, right? You can do public education, you can convene players, you can do media, you can do research, you can do things that are not considered lobbying. Next slide. And very specifically, while you cannot earmark grants for ballot measure work, you can make grants to public charities for a variety of purposes, right? So you can fund activities to educate the public about the ballot measure process or educate your grantees on the fact that they can do ballot measure work and what they're allowed to do. You can have conversations with your colleagues and grantees about the importance of ballot measures. You can get rid of unnecessary clauses in grants that forbid lobbying altogether. You can give general support grants, which the public charity grantee can then decide to use for ballot measure work. You can engage in communications that qualify as nonpartisan analysis and are not considered to be lobbying. You can engage in communications that are neutral, that do not reflect a view on the ballot measure, but urge voters to study the issue. And you can invite grantees. Sure, give us a proposal that includes ballot measure work, right? So I know we're running short on time, so I will leave you with hoping that all of you who can and have not yet will take the 501H election if your org hasn't already, and start putting some thought into engaging in ballot measures, even if for those who can lobby, it's a simple endorsement of one measure, or for those who can't lobby, having some conversations with your grantees about ballot measures and how to engage, and making sure they know it's okay. And I will kick it back to Emily, I believe, to close us out and do some questions and answers. Yeah?
Yeah, thanks, Rhiannon. That was really great. So we do have one question in the Q&A box. Does registering for 501H last continually, or is it per year / per election cycle, and is it reversible?
My understanding, I would have to double check. My understanding is once you take it, you have taken it, and then you can not, I guess, back out of it or reverse it. But you don't have to do it every year, is my understanding. I would have to double check on that.
Okay. Reminder to put any questions you have in the Q&A box. And we're being confirmed in the chat box. Yes, the 501H election is effective until you file a revocation on the same form. Thank you for that clarification. More questions coming in. Okay, if we are invited to speak at a hearing committee, does that count as lobbying?
Specifically for pieces of legislation, if you are given an invitation in writing to speak at a committee hearing, that is not considered lobbying. The caveat to that is you cannot ask to be invited. It has to come officially from the committee with no kind of invitation from you.
Great, thanks. So if we don't have any other questions, feel free to keep populating them in the Q&A box and the chat. I would welcome any of our speakers to share last-minute thoughts on ballot measures, especially within the context of an election season. Oh, we've got some more questions, so I'll hold off on that request. What if it's an open invite to the public? Is that lobbying? Testing your knowledge here, Rhiannon.
Is that it? Are you talking about a hearing again? The same thing that if it's an open invitation to the public of
believe
lobbying?
So. Yes.
That it has to be a specific invitation to you. An open invite to the public, if you show up, that's then lobbying. And in the chat there as well, Boulder Advocacy is an absolutely fantastic resource. And we'll make sure I have a couple of resources specifically from them that we can send around with the follow-up email.
Great, thank you. So just to reiterate, the webinar recording and all these resources that we've talked about will be emailed out to registrants in a few days. Just want to reiterate some of what Carla said. You know, some of the calls to action here are just to be having conversations between the nonprofit and philanthropic sectors. You know, having philanthropy recognize that it's not just financial support that's meaningful, especially in these election cycles, but that support for organizations and conversations with your grantees are going to be really meaningful so that philanthropy can support work that's already being done in the sector. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel. We invite nonprofits to also have those conversations with philanthropy to talk about what their communities really need. And to also pay attention to what's going on at elections and ballots and legislation at the federal, state, and regional levels. So, you know, a lot happens locally, just this, even though it feels like federal is always in the news, making sure to pay attention to what's going on in our state and in our regions is also really important. So we're going to end a little early. We'll give you a little bit of time back, but we appreciate you joining us so much. Thank you again to the California Policy Forum staff who helped put this on, and to our speakers. We'll send you those resources soon, and we hope to see you at the next one. Thanks so much, everyone.